A millionaire disguised himself as a paralytic to test his son's girlfriend and see how he was treated. Richard Anderson gazed out at the city from the window of his luxurious penthouse, his eyes reflecting a mix of determination and apprehension. At 55 years old, he had built a business empire that placed him among the most powerful men in the country. However, at that moment, his mind was occupied by a much more personal matter: his son's future wife. "Mr. Anderson, everything is ready as you requested," his assistant announced, interrupting his thoughts. Richard turned, nodding gravely. "Thank you, Martin. Remember, from now on, I'm Robert Sanders, a humble administrative employee." Martin, visibly uncomfortable, dared to question. "Sir, are you sure you want to go through with this? There are other ways to investigate Miss Rodriguez." "No, Martin," Richard replied. Firmly, "I need to see for myself who Chloe really is when she thinks no one is watching. My son deserves to know the truth before he makes the biggest mistake of his life." With those words, Richard headed to the bedroom where his new identity awaited him. He looked in the mirror as he put on a grey wig and thick-framed glasses. The elegant suit gave way to a worn shirt and loose pants. Finally, he sat in the wheelchair that would be his companion for the next few weeks. As he practiced his new posture, Richard couldn't help but let his mind wander to the past. He remembered his sister Eleanor, the sparkle in her eyes when she told him about her innovative business idea. That idea he had stolen without remorse, turning it into the foundation of his fortune. The weight of guilt, buried for years under layers of success and wealth, began to resurface. "No," he told himself, shaking his head. "This is for Andrew. I can't let Chloe deceive him like I deceived Elena." Across town, in a modest apartment, Chloe Rodriguez was preparing for her day. At 28, she was a beautiful and ambitious woman, with a smile that hid years of struggle and resentment. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" asked Mark, her real boyfriend, as he watched her apply her makeup. Chloe turned, her eyes shining with a mix of determination and pain. "We don't have a choice, Mark. Richard Anderson owes this to my mother, to me, to us. If he thinks he can buy my silence with some crumbs of his fortune, he's very wrong." Mark hugged her from behind, resting his chin on Chloe's shoulder. "Just be careful, okay? Andrew may be a spoiled brat, but he doesn't deserve this." For a moment, Chloe's mask cracked, revealing a hint of guilt. "I know," she whispered, "but it's too late to back out. Now Richard Anderson will pay for what he did to my mother, even if it's the last thing I do." Meanwhile, in the Anderson mansion, Andrew was waking up without knowing that his life was about to change forever. The young heir, 30 years old, stretched his arms and smiled, thinking of Chloe. He was convinced he had found the love of his life, unaware of the secrets and lies that would soon threaten to destroy everything he thought he knew about his family and his future. That afternoon in a park near the Anderson Company, Richard, now transformed into Robert Sanders, nervously waited for the moment to set his plan in motion. He saw Chloe approaching, as beautiful and elegant as always. He took a deep breath and prepared for the first act of his elaborate charade. "Excuse me, miss," he called out in a trembling voice, perfectly playing the role of an older and vulnerable man. "Could you help me? I think I'm lost." Chloe stopped, looking at the apparent elderly man in a wheelchair. For an instant, Richard thought he saw a flash of compassion in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by an expression of annoyance. "I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry," she responded dryly, averting her gaze and quickening her pace. Richard watched her walk away, a mix of disappointment and sadness flooding his chest. "So it's true," he murmured to himself. "She's only interested in the money." What Richard didn't know was that as she walked away, Chloe was battling her own demons. The image of the helpless old man had awakened memories of her mother, Eleanor, struggling alone to raise her after Richard had stolen everything from them. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to choke back the lump in her throat. "I'm sorry, Mom," she thought, "but I can't afford to be weak now, not when we're so close to getting justice." As the three protagonists immersed themselves in their own thoughts and plans, The sun began to set over the city, tinting the sky in orange and reddish hues. It was the prelude to an emotional storm that would soon break out, forever changing the fate of the Anderson family. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries for Richard. Under his disguise as Robert Sanders, he managed to infiltrate Chloe's daily life, observing her from afar and creating casual encounters that allowed him to interact with her. Each interaction only seemed to confirm his initial suspicions. Chloe appeared cold and distant to those she considered inferior, reserving her charm and kindness for people of influence. Richard couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment every time he saw her ignore someone in need or make a derogatory comment about common people. However, it was during a rainy afternoon when Richard finally obtained the proof he was looking for. Sitting in his wheelchair under the awning of a cafe, he saw Chloe hurriedly exit an office building. The young woman walked with determination, holding her umbrella tightly against the wind. Suddenly, a man approached her. Richard immediately recognized Mark, Chloe's supposed best friend. To his surprise and horror, he saw Mark grab her by the waist and kiss her passionately. Richard's heart raced. Here was the proof he needed, the confirmation that Chloe was cheating on his son. But then, something unexpected happened. As he observed the scene, he caught fragments of their conversation. "How's the plan going?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Everything is going according to plan," Chloe replied. "Andrew doesn't suspect a thing. Soon we'll have access to all the information we need to bring down Richard Anderson." These words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Not only was Chloe cheating on Andrew, but she was also planning something against him. But why? What could she have against him? Determined to get to the bottom of the matter, Richard intensified his investigation. Using his contacts and resources, he began to dig into Chloe's past. What he discovered left him breathless. Chloe Rodriguez was not a greedy stranger looking for easy money. She was his own niece, Eleanor's daughter, his sister, whom he had betrayed years ago. Memories, long repressed, began to flood his mind. The excitement on Elena's face when she told him about her revolutionary idea, the greed that blinded him, leading him to steal that idea and leave his sister with nothing. The overwhelming doorway approached and hugged her from behind. "Chloe, are you sure this is what you want? Revenge won't bring your mother back." Chloe turned, her eyes shining with a mix of determination and pain. "It's not just about revenge, Mark. It's about justice. Richard Anderson destroyed our lives. He deserves to lose everything he built on lies." However, even as she spoke these words, a part of Chloe doubted. The image of the old man in the wheelchair she had ignored days ago still haunted her. Was she becoming the type of person she had always despised? Across town, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him, Andrew Anderson was planning his future with Chloe. Sitting in his office, he smiled as he looked at the engagement ring he planned to give her in the coming days. "It will be perfect," he thought, imagining the life they would build together. "Chloe is everything I've ever wanted." Little did he know that his world was about to crumble, that the people he trusted most held secrets that threatened to destroy everything. As the night progressed, the three protagonists found themselves trapped in their own internal struggles. Richard, consumed by guilt and desperately seeking a way to redeem himself. Chloe, torn between her desire for revenge and the fear of losing her humanity in the process. And Andrew, living in a bubble of happiness that would soon burst. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. The truth, so long buried, was about to come to light, and no one was prepared for the consequences it would bring. The following days were torment for Richard. The weight of his discovery overwhelmed him, robbing him of sleep and clouding every waking moment. He found himself trapped in a labyrinth of guilt. Ever wanted. Little did he know that his world was about to crumble, that the people he trusted most held secrets that threatened to destroy everything. As the night progressed, the three protagonists found themselves trapped in their own internal struggles. Richard, consumed by guilt and desperately seeking a way to redeem himself. Chloe, torn between her desire for revenge and the fear of losing her humanity in the process. And Andrew, living in a bubble of happiness that would soon burst. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. The truth, so long buried, was about to come to light, and no one was prepared for the consequences it would bring. The following days were torment for Richard. The weight of his discovery overwhelmed him, robbing him of sleep and clouding every waking moment. He found himself trapped in a labyrinth of guilt and remorse, desperately seeking an exit that seemed increasingly distant. One morning, as he ate breakfast alone in his enormous dining room, Richard made a decision. He couldn't keep living with this secret. He needed to confess, face the consequences of his past actions, and somehow try to repair the damage he had caused. With trembling hands, he dialed the number of his lawyer and trusted friend, Albert Morgan. "Albert," he said, as soon as the other answered, his voice breaking slightly, "I need to see you urgently. It's about the will." Hours later, sitting across from Albert in the study of his mansion, Richard finally let out the truth that had been eating him up inside. "Chloe Rodriguez, Andrew's fiancée, she's my niece," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the floor. "She's Eleanor's daughter, my sister." Albert, who had witnessed Richard's meteoric rise in the business world, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Richard, what are you saying? How is this possible?" With a deep sigh, Richard proceeded to tell the whole story. He spoke of Elena's brilliant idea, of how he had stolen it without remorse, of the years of success built on that betrayal. With each word, he felt as if a weight was lifting from his shoulders, only to be replaced by an even heavier burden of shame and regret. "I need to do something, Albert," he concluded, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't change the past, but maybe I can give Chloe the future I stole from her." Albert, recovering from the initial shock, leaned forward. "What do you have in mind, Richard?" "I want to include her in my will," Richard replied with determination. "Give her a significant part of my fortune. It's the least I can do after all the harm I've caused." The lawyer looked at him with concern. "Richard, I understand your guilt, but have you considered the consequences? What will happen to Andrew? How do you think he'll react when he finds out about all this?" Richard ran a hand over his face, the weariness evident in every line of his expression. "I don't know, Albert. I know this could destroy my relationship with my son, but what other choice do I have? I can't keep living with this lie." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Chloe was preparing for a dinner with Andrew. In front of the mirror, she applied her makeup with expert hands, but her mind was far away, lost in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Mark watched her from the bed, his face a mask of concern. "Chloe, are you sure you want to go through with this? Every day I see you more distant." Chloe turned, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and doubt. "I can't back down now, Mark. We've come too far." But even as she spoke these words, a part of her wavered. The image of Andrew, always kind and loving, mixed in, her mind with that of the mysterious old man in a wheelchair she had ignored days ago. Was she becoming the type of person she had always despised? That night, during dinner, Andrew noticed something different about Chloe. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she seemed lost in her thoughts. "Is everything okay, love?" he asked, taking her hand across the table. Chloe startled slightly, as if she had forgotten where she was. Yes, everything's fine. I'm just a little tired, that's all." Andrew looked at her with concern, but decided not to push. Instead, he pulled a small box from his pocket. "Well, I hope this cheers you up a bit," he said with a nervous smile. Chloe's eyes widened when she saw the ring. It was beautiful, delicate and evidently expensive, just the type of jewelry she would have coveted when she began this revenge plan. But now, looking at Andrew's hopeful face, she felt a pang of guilt so intense it almost made her gasp. "Chloe Rodriguez," Andrew said, his voice trembling slightly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Time seemed to stand still. Chloe looked at the ring, then at Andrew, and suddenly her whole plan, all her revenge, seemed to crumble. How had she come to this point? How could she be considering marrying a man she planned to destroy? she began, her voice barely a whisper. But before she could respond, her phone rang. It was a message from Mark. "We have a problem. Richard Anderson just made changes to his will." Chloe's heart raced. What was going on? Had Richard discovered her plan? "I'm sorry, Andrew," she said, standing up abruptly. I need some time to think. It's too sudden." And with those words, she ran out of the restaurant, leaving a confused and hurt Andrew holding a ring that represented a future that now seemed more uncertain than ever. Meanwhile, in his mansion, Richard looked out the window. His reflection blending with the city lights, he had made a decision that could change everything. He only hoped it wasn't too late to amend his past mistakes. The next morning dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather reflected the emotional turmoil the protagonists of this story were experiencing. Richard, who had barely slept, prepared to face the consequences of his decision. In his office, Andrew reread for the umpteenth time the message Chloe had sent him the night before. "I need time to think. Please don't look for me for a few days." Every word was like a dagger in his heart. What had he done? Wrong? Why had Chloe reacted like this? Meanwhile, in her modest apartment, Chloe paced back and forth, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Mark watched her with concern. "What are we going to do, Chloe?" he finally asked. "If Richard has changed his will, our whole plan could be in danger." Chloe stopped, looking out the window. The rain hit the glass, creating patterns that seemed to reflect the chaos inside her. "I don't know. Mark, I'm not sure of anything anymore." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Chloe and Mark exchanged looks of surprise and fear. Who could it be? Cautiously, Chloe approached the door and looked through the peephole. What she saw left her breathless. There, in the hallway, was the old man in a wheelchair she had ignored days ago, but now, without the wig and glasses, Chloe recognized the face she had seen so many times in old photographs, next to her mother. It's Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark looked at her with wide eyes. "What? Are you sure?" Chloe nodded, her hand trembling on the doorknob. After a moment of hesitation, she finally opened it. Richard looked up, his eyes full of a mixture of guilt and hope. "Hello, Chloe," he said softly. "I think it's time we talked." The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe felt as if the world had stopped. All her plans, her carefully orchestrated revenge, seemed to crumble before her. How did you find me?" she finally managed to ask. Richard gave a sad smile. "I've always known where you were, Chloe. I've been following your life from afar for years. The guilt has never left me." Chloe felt her legs weaken. She leaned against the doorframe, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "Why are you here now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Richard took a deep breath. "Because it's time to face my mistakes, to try to repair the damage I caused, Chloe. I know what you're planning. I know why you're with Andrew." Chloe's heart stopped for an instant. Did he know everything? How? She felt panic growing inside her, but before she could say anything, Richard continued, "And I don't blame you. You have every right to hate me, to want revenge. What I did to your mother, to you, is unforgivable." Tears began to form in Chloe's eyes. Years of repressed anger, of pain and resentment, threatened to overflow. "Do you have any idea what you did to us?" she spat, her voice breaking. "My mother died believing her own brother had betrayed her. I grew up with nothing while you lived in opulence." Richard lowered his gaze, each of Chloe's words like a direct blow to his heart. "I know," he said softly, "and there's not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions. That's why I'm here, Chloe, not to ask for forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it, but to try to make things right." Chloe looked at him with distrust. "What do you mean?" "I've changed my will," Richard explained. "I've included you as an heir to a significant part of my fortune. It's not compensation for what I did. Nothing could be. But I hope it gives you the chance to have the life I stole from you." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with emotions contained for years. Chloe looked at Mark, who seemed as surprised as she was. and then back at Richard. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Why after so many years?" Richard smiled sadly. "Because I finally had the courage to face my mistakes, and because I saw in you the girl I once promised to protect, Chloe. I know I have no right to ask you anything, but please, don't go ahead with your plan. Don't become someone like me." Richard's words resonated in Chloe's mind. All her plans, her desire for revenge, now seemed so empty, so insignificant in the face of this unexpected show of remorse. She began, but the words got stuck in her throat. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway caught their attention. They all turned to see Andrew, breathless and pale-faced, standing in the doorway. "Dad," he said, his gaze passing from Richard to Chloe and then to Mark. What's going on here?" The silence that followed was deafening. The truth, so long hidden, was about to come to light, and no one was prepared for the consequences. It would bring. Chloe's apartment became the epicenter of an emotional storm that had been brewing for years. Andrew, still at the door, looked at the scene before him with a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "Can someone explain to me what's going on here?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly. Richard, still in his wheelchair, turned to face his son. The weight of years and secrets seemed to have fallen upon him at once, aging him, decades in a matter of minutes. "Andrew," he began, his voice laden with emotion, "there's a lot I need to tell you. Things I should have told you a long time ago." Chloe, for her part, felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Her entire plan, her carefully constructed life, was about to fall apart. She looked at Mark, seeking support, but he seemed as lost as she was. "Andrew," she finally said, taking a step towards him. But Andrew raised a hand, stopping her. His eyes, usually warm and loving, now shone with a mixture of pain and betrayal. "No," he said firmly. "I want to hear it from my father first." Richard took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the truth he had hidden for so long. "Son, Chloe is your cousin." The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew stepped back as if he had received a physical blow, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "What?" he finally managed to articulate. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Richard proceeded to tell the whole story, his sister Eleanor's brilliant idea, how he had stolen it, the empire he had built on that betrayal, and how he had left Elena and young Chloe in poverty. With each word, Andrew felt as if his world was crumbling. He looked at Chloe, searching her eyes for some sign that this was all a cruel joke. But what he saw was a mixture of guilt, fear, and surprisingly relief. "Did you know?" Andrew asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you know who you were when we started dating?" Chloe nodded slowly, tears running down her cheeks. "Yes," she admitted, "I knew from the beginning." Andrew felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. All the love, all the moments they had shared. Had they been a lie? "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice breaking. "Why did you pretend to love me?" Chloe took a step towards him, her eyes pleading. At first, it was for revenge. I wanted to make your father suffer, as he made my mother and me suffer." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "But Andrew, over time my feelings changed. What I feel for you is real." Andrew stepped back, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice laden with pain. "You can't expect me to believe that now." He turned to his father, anger quickly replacing the initial shock. "And you," he said, pointing at Richard. "How could you hide something like this from me? How could you allow me to fall in love with my own cousin?" Richard lowered his head, guilt evident in every line of his face. "I'm sorry, son. When I realized who Chloe was, it was already too late. I tried to keep you away from her, but what?" Andrew interrupted, his voice rising. "You decided to sit back and watch as I fell in love with her, as I planned to marry her." Richard flinched at his son's fury. I thought I could fix everything. Before it went too far, I thought that if I uncovered the truth about Chloe's plans, I could protect you without having to reveal our past." Andrew, let out a bitter laugh, devoid of humor. "Protect me? Is that what you think you've been doing?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every one of his movements. "God, is there anything in my life that isn't a lie?" Chloe took a step towards him, her eyes pleading, "Andrew, please, I know I've hurt you, but—" "Hurt me?" Andrew interrupted, turning to her. "Chloe, you made me believe you loved me. I was ready to spend the rest of my life with you. And all this time, you were planning to get revenge on my father." Mark, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "It's not that simple. Andrew, Chloe really developed feelings for you. What started as a revenge plan turned into something more." Andrew looked at Mark as if seeing him for the first time. "And who are you in all of this? Another lost cousin?" Chloe lowered her gaze, guilt evident on her face. "Mark was my boyfriend before I met you." This new revelation was like a final blow for Andrew. He stepped back, leaning against the wall, as if the weight of all these revelations was too much to bear. "This is insane," he muttered. My whole life has been a lie." Richard tried to approach his son, but Andrew stopped him with a look. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "Don't you dare try to comfort me now." He turned to the door, ready to leave, but before doing so, he looked at Chloe one last time. "Did you ever really love me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe, with tears running down her cheeks, nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "More than I ever thought possible." Andrew closed his eyes, as if those words caused him physical pain. Without saying anything else, he left the apartment, leaving behind a deafening silence. Richard, Chloe, and Mark remained there, motionless, each lost in their own thoughts and regrets. The weight of years of secrets and lies seemed to fill the room, making it difficult even to breathe. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "I've ruined everything," he said, his voice broken by emotion. "My son hates me, and rightfully so." Chloe approached him, surprising herself by feeling a pang of compassion for the man she had hated for so long. "You're not the only one who's made mistakes," she said softly. "We all share the blame in this." Mark nodded, approaching Chloe and putting a hand on her shoulder. "The question is, what do we do now?" Richard looked up, a spark of determination shining in his tired eyes. "Now," he said, "we try to fix what we've broken. It won't be easy and it may be impossible, but we have to try." Chloe looked towards the door where Andrew had left, her heart torn between the love she felt for him and the guilt for everything she had done. "Do you think he'll ever be able to forgive us?" she asked. Richard sighed deeply. "I don't know, Chloe, but I know we have to try for Andrew, for ourselves and for your mother's memory. It's time for this family to heal the wounds of the past." As the three looked at each other, united by a bond of guilt, regret, and a faint hope of redemption, outside the storm was finally beginning to subside. But in their hearts, they knew that the real storm was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for all involved. Andrew had taken refuge in the family's country house, refusing to answer calls or messages from anyone. Richard, consumed by guilt, spent hours locked in his study, reviewing old photographs and documents, as if in them he could find the key to repairing the damage he had caused. Chloe, for her part, was torn between the relief that the truth had finally come to light and the fear of having forever lost the man who, against all odds, she had come to love. Mark remained by her side, a silent pillar of support, although he himself struggled with his own conflicting feelings. A week after the confrontation, Richard decided it was time to act. He couldn't keep allowing the past to dictate his family's future. With determination, he called Chloe. "We need to talk," he said when she answered. "All of us, it's time to face this together." Chloe felt a knot in her stomach, but she knew Richard was right. "Where?" she asked simply. "At the old summer house," Richard replied, "where it all began." Hours later, Richard, Chloe, and Mark found themselves in front of a picturesque country house surrounded by century-old trees. The place seemed straight out of a fairy tale, but for Richard and Chloe, it was loaded with bittersweet memories. "This is where Eleanor told me her idea," Richard said softly as they walked up the gravel path. "We were sitting on the porch, drinking lemonade. She was so excited." Chloe felt a lump form in her throat. Her mother had told her about this place, about the happy summers before everything fell apart. "Do you think Andrew will come?" she asked, changing the subject. Richard nodded. "I left him a message. He knows this place as well as I do. If he wants to talk, he'll come." They entered the house, dust and memories floating in the air. Richard headed straight for the living room, where an old family photograph occupied a place of honor above the fireplace. In it, a young Richard smiled next to Elena, both hugging a small Chloe. "We were so happy," Richard murmured, his voice laden with regret. "How could I have been so selfish as to destroy all this?" Chloe approached, looking at the photograph with a mixture of nostalgia and pain. "You weren't the only one who made mistakes," she said softly. "I also let resentment consume me. I was so focused on revenge that I didn't realize I was becoming what I always hated." Mark, who had been observing in silence, finally spoke. "We've all made mistakes. The question is, how do we fix them?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of the door opening startled them. Andrew entered the room, his face a mask of contained emotions. "Andrew," Richard said, taking a step towards his son, "thank you for coming." Andrew looked at each of those, present, his gaze lingering on Chloe. "I'm not here to forgive," he finally said. "I'm here because I deserve the truth, the whole truth." Richard nodded, indicating for everyone to sit down. "You're right, son. It's time you knew the whole story." Over the next few hours, Richard narrated in detail the events that had led to the break with Elena, the stolen idea, the years of success built on a lie Chloe, her voice breaking with emotion, spoke of her childhood in poverty, her mother's death, and how the desire for revenge had shaped every aspect of her life. Andrew listened in silence, his face a mixture of pain, anger, and occasionally, understanding. When they finally spoke, his words surprised everyone. "I understand why you did it," he said, looking at Chloe. "I can't say I approve, but I understand where that pain came from." Then he turned to his father. "But how could you hide something like this from me my entire life?" Richard lowered his gaze, shame evident in every line of his face. "There's no excuse, Andrew. I was a coward. Each year that passed, it became harder to tell the truth. I thought I was protecting you, but in reality, I was only protecting myself." Andrew stood up, walking to the window. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky in orange and pink hues. "You know," he finally said, "I grew up thinking I had the perfect family, the successful father, the loving mother, the privileged life. Now I realize it was all an illusion." He turned to look at them. "I can't forgive you, not now. Maybe I'll never be able to do it completely, but I can't deny that despite the lies and secrets, I love you, all of you." Chloe felt tears running down her cheeks. "Andrew, But he stopped her with a gesture. "No, Chloe. What we had, what I thought we had, that's over. But you're my family, even though I never knew it, and that means something." Richard approached, his son tentative. "What can we do, Andrew? How can we start to repair all this?" Andrew looked at his father, then at Chloe, and finally at Mark. "We can start with the truth, the whole truth, no more secrets or lies, and then we'll see if it's possible to rebuild something from the ashes of what we destroyed." As the sun set over the old summer house, the four looked at each other, united by a bond of blood, pain, and perhaps a faint hope of redemption. The path to healing would be long and difficult, but at least now, for the first time in years, they were walking together. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Life in the Anderson mansion had changed dramatically since that revealing afternoon at the summer. House Richard, determined to make amends for his mistakes, had initiated a process of transformation, both personal and business-wise. On a sunny morning, Richard convened an extraordinary board meeting. Facing the surprised faces of his executives, he announced, "Gentlemen, for years we have operated under a lie. The success of our company was built on a stolen idea. Today, that changes." With trembling hands but a firm voice, Richard proceeded to detail how he planned to restructure the company, creating a foundation in Elena's honor. that would be dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs. Additionally, he announced that a significant portion of the profits would be allocated to charitable causes. "I know this may seem crazy," he concluded, looking at the stunned faces around him. "But it's the right thing to do, and it's time for this company to be based on integrity, not deception." Meanwhile, Chloe was struggling with her own demons. She had quit her job and spent her days between therapy and volunteering at a local community center. One afternoon, while helping with a literacy program, she found herself face to face with a girl who reminded her of herself as a child. "Why do you do this?" the girl asked curiously. "You seem too fancy to be here." Chloe smiled a bit sadly. "Because there was a time when I forgot what really matters, and now I'm trying to remember it." Andrew, for his part, had decided to distance himself from the family business. He embarked on a journey of self-discovery, working on humanitarian aid projects around the world. Every time Richard or Chloe received a postcard or a brief message from him, they felt a mixture of relief and longing. One night, months after the confrontation, Richard received an unexpected call. "Dad," Andrew's voice said on the other end of the line. "I'm at the airport, I'm coming back home." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "Son, I'm so glad to hear from you. Do you want me to come pick you up?" There was a pause. "No, it's okay. I'll take a taxi, but could we talk tomorrow? There's something important I want to discuss with you." That night, Richard could barely sleep when dawn finally broke. He found himself as nervous as a teenager before his first date. Andrew arrived punctually, his face tanned by the sun and his eyes filled with a new determination. "Dad," he said after a brief hug, "I've been thinking a lot during these months about our family, about the past and about the future." Richard nodded, inviting his son to sit down. "I've been reflecting too, Andrew. Every day I realize how much damage I caused with my actions." Andrew looked at his father, noticing the new wrinkles on his face, the weight of guilt still visible in his eyes. "I know, Dad, and although it still hurts, everything that happened, I've also seen the efforts you've been making to change things." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Son, but Andrew gently interrupted him. "Let me finish, please. During my trip, I worked with many people who have suffered injustices, who have lost everything. And I realized that despite everything, we have the opportunity to make things right, to use our resources to make a real difference." Richard's eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and hope. "What are you suggesting?" "I want to return to the company," Andrew said firmly, "but not like before. I want to lead the foundation you've created in honor of Aunt Elena. I want to make sure we're really helping those in need, that we're giving real opportunities to young entrepreneurs." Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. "Andrew, you don't know how much this means. To me, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but..." Andrew took his father's hand. "It's not about deserving, Dad. It's about choosing to be better, to build something good from our mistakes, and I want us to do that together." As father and son began to discuss plans for the future, across town, Chloe was preparing for an encounter she had been postponing for months. With her heart beating rapidly, she entered a small cafe. At a table in the back, Mark was waiting for her, his face a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Hi, Chloe," he said softly when she sat down across from him. "I'm glad you came." Chloe gave him a small smile. "I'm glad too, Mark. I think it was time we talked." Over the next few hours, Chloe and Mark had the most honest conversation of their relationship. They talked about their mistakes, about how the revenge plan had changed them both, and about the genuine feelings that had emerged along the way. "I loved you, Mark," Chloe said with tears in her eyes. "A part of me will always love you, but..." Mark nodded, understanding. "But you also fell in love with Andrew. For real?" Chloe lowered her gaze. "Yes, and I know I've lost him forever. But that doesn't change how I feel. I'm so sorry, Mark. I'm sorry for dragging you into all of this." Mark took her hand across the table. "I'm sorry too, Chloe. I should have been stronger. I should have stopped you. But now, I just want you to be happy, to find peace." As they said goodbye, both felt as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a new beginning, an opportunity to heal and grow. That night, Richard organized a family dinner. For the first time in months, Andrew, Chloe, and he sat together at the table. The tension was palpable, but there was also an air of hope. "Before we begin," Richard said, raising his glass, "I want to propose a toast to the mistakes that brought us here, to the pain we've overcome, and to the future we can build together as a family." Andrew and Chloe exchanged a look, years of complex emotions passing between them in an instant. Then slowly they raised their glasses. "To family," Andrew said softly. "To redemption," Chloe added. As they toasted, the three felt that something was beginning to heal. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of uncomfortable conversations and moments of doubt. But for the first time in years, there was hope. Hope that, from the ashes of their mistakes, they could build something beautiful and meaningful. The following months were a period of intense transformation for the Anderson family. The Elena Foundation, led by Andrew, began to take shape and gain recognition in the business and philanthropic world. One sunny morning, Andrew was in his new office reviewing applications from young entrepreneurs when he received an unexpected visit. "May I come in?" Chloe asked, peeking timidly through the door. Andrew looked up, surprised. Despite the months that had passed and efforts to rebuild family ties, they still hadn't had many opportunities to be alone. "Of course, come in," he responded, trying to maintain a neutral tone. Chloe entered, carrying a folder in her hands. She sat across from Andrew, visibly nervous. I have a proposal for the foundation," she finally said. "I've been working on a project to help women in vulnerable situations start their own businesses. I thought maybe you'd be interested." Andrew took the folder, leafing through its contents with genuine interest. As he read, his expression changed from surprise to admiration. "This is impressive, Chloe," he finally said. "You've thought of everything from training to psychological support." Chloe smiled shyly. "Thank you. I've been working on this for months. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that could really help other people who have been through difficult situations." Andrew looked at her, recognizing for the first time how much Chloe had changed. She was no longer the vengeful woman he had known, but someone who genuinely wanted to make a difference. "I'd like you to present this at the next board meeting," Andrew said. "I think it could be exactly the kind of project we're looking for." Chloe's eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Really, I thank you, Andrew. It means a lot to me." For a moment they looked at each other, years of shared history passing between them. Andrew was the first to break the silence. "Chloe, I want you to know that I'm proud of you, of how you've handled all of this, of how you're trying to do things right." Chloe felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, Andrew. I'm proud of you too. What you're doing with the foundation, it's incredible." Before they could say more, they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Richard entered, surprising himself to see them together. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, making a gesture to leave. "No, it's okay, Dad," Andrew said. "In fact, I think you should hear this. Chloe has an interesting proposal for the foundation." Richard looked at his son and his niece, a mixture of emotions crossing his face. "I'd love to hear it," he finally said, sitting down next to them, as Chloe began to explain her project. With Andrew and Richard listening attentively and asking questions, the three felt that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't a return to what they had been before, but the beginning of something new, potentially stronger and more meaningful. That night, after a long and productive meeting, Richard found himself in his study, looking at an old photograph of Elena. "I wish you could see this, sister," he murmured. "I wish you could see how your daughter is honoring your memory, how we're all trying to do things right." Meanwhile, in her apartment, Chloe looked out the window, reflecting on the day's events. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was on the right path, that she was honoring her mother's memory in the right way. And in his own home, Andrew prepared for bed, his mind full of ideas for the foundation and, surprisingly, a renewed appreciation for his family. Despite everything they had been through, despite the pain and lies, he realized they were finding a new way to be together, to be a family. As the city slept, the three members of the Anderson family, each in their own space but united by a common purpose, felt a spark of hope for the future. A future that, although different from what they had imagined, promised to be more authentic and meaningful than ever. As the months passed, the Elena Foundation began to gain recognition and respect in the world of philanthropy. Chloe's project to empower women in vulnerable situations had been a resounding success, changing lives and generating opportunities where none existed before. However, not everything was rosy. One morning, Andrew rushed into Richard's office, his face tense with concern. "Dad, we have a problem," he said, closing the door behind him. "I just got a call from our legal department. Someone is threatening to expose the truth about the company's origin." Richard paled. Despite his efforts to amend his mistakes, the past seemed determined to haunt them. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We don't know for sure," Andrew replied, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "But whoever it is, they have documents, emails, evidence that could destroy everything we've built." At that moment, Chloe entered the office, her face showing confusion at seeing the tension in the atmosphere. "What's going on?" she asked Andrew. Briefed her on the situation. Chloe listened in silence, her mind working at full speed. I think I know who might be behind this," she finally said, her voice trembling. Richard and Andrew looked at her expectantly. "Mark," Chloe said, "he knew all the details of our original plan. If anyone has evidence that could harm us, it's him." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice laden with determination. "I'm not going to allow this to destroy what we've accomplished," he said. "This isn't just about protecting the company's name, it's about protecting Elena's legacy, ensuring we can continue to help those in need." Andrew nodded, although concern still clouded his face. "What do you suggest we do?" "I'm going to talk to Mark," Chloe said, surprising everyone, including herself. I think I can make him see reason." Richard and Andrew exchanged looks of doubt. "Chloe, you don't have to do this," Andrew said softly. "It's not your responsibility to fix my mistakes," Richard added, but Chloe stood firm. "It's our responsibility, all of us. We've come too far as a family to let the past destroy us now." With those words, Chloe left the office, leaving Richard and Andrew immersed in thoughtful silence. Hours later, Chloe found herself in front of Mark's apartment, her heart pounding. After several attempts, she finally mustered the courage and rang the doorbell. Mark opened the door, his face a mask of surprise at seeing her. "Chloe," he said, his voice a mixture of emotions, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Mark, we need to talk," Chloe said, her voice firm, despite her nerves. "It's important." Once inside, Chloe got straight to the point. She told Mark about the threat, about the fear that everything they had worked for would come crashing down. "Was it you?" she finally asked, her eyes searching his. "Are you trying to expose us?" Mark looked at her, hurt. "Do you really think I would do something like that?" "I don't know, Mark," Chloe responded honestly. "So many things have happened. But I need to know. We need to know." Mark stood up, walking to the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with emotion. "No, Chloe, it wasn't me. Despite everything that happened between us, I would never do something that could hurt you like that." Chloe felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but at the same time a new worry arose. If it wasn't Mark, who was behind these threats? "I believe you," she said softly. "And thank you, Mark, for not using what you know against us." Mark turned to look at her, a sad smile on his face. "Chloe, despite everything, I've changed too. Seeing how you and the Andersons are trying to do things right, it made me realize that revenge only brings more pain." Chloe felt a wave of gratitude towards the man who had once been her accomplice and her love. "Mark, if it wasn't you, do you have any idea who might be behind this?" Mark frowned, thoughtful. "There's something you should know," he finally said. "A few weeks ago, I received a call from someone who claimed to be an investigative journalist. He was asking questions about the Andersons and the origin of their fortune." Chloe's heart skipped a beat. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing concrete," Mark replied, "but he gave me the impression that he already knew a lot, Chloe. I think you should be careful. Whoever is behind this seems to have resources and determination. Chloe thanked Mark for the information and said goodbye, her mind working at full speed. Back at the Anderson mansion, she shared what she had discovered with Richard and Andrew. "An investigative journalist," Richard muttered, pacing the room. "This could be more serious than we thought." Andrew, who had been silent, finally spoke. "I think I know who might be behind this," he said, his voice laden with regret. "A few months ago, we rejected a funding request for a journalistic investigation project. The applicant, a certain Gabriel Soto, didn't take the rejection well. He swore he would expose the true nature of our foundation." Richard and Chloe exchanged looks of concern. "Do you think he could have discovered something about the past?" Chloe asked. "It's possible," Andrew replied. "Gabriel is known for his tenacity. If he started digging into our history—" "We have to do something," Richard interrupted. "We can't allow years of hard work and redemption to come crashing down because of past mistakes." Chloe, who had been listening attentively, suddenly had an idea. What if instead of trying to stop him, we cooperate with him? Richard and Andrew looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" Andrew asked. "Think about it," Chloe continued. "We've been trying to do things right, to be transparent. What would happen if we got ahead of his investigation? If we told our story with all its flaws and mistakes, but also showing how we've tried to make amends?" Richard seemed to consider the idea. "It's risky." He finally said, "We could lose everything, or we could gain something much more valuable," Andrew responded, a spark of hope in his eyes. "The public's trust, the opportunity to really leave the past behind." After hours of discussion, they finally reached an agreement. They would contact Gabriel Soto and offer him an exclusive interview where they would reveal the whole truth about the origin of the Anderson fortune and how they were trying to rectify past mistakes. The night before the interview, the three gathered in Richard's study. The atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Richard said, looking at Andrew and Chloe, "I want you to know how proud I am of you, of how you've handled all of this, of how you've grown." Chloe felt a lump form in her throat. "Uncle Richard, I thank you for giving me the chance to be part of this family. Truly." Andrew took Chloe's hand, surprising her. "We are a family," he said softly, "with all our mistakes and complications, but a family nonetheless." As they prepared for the interview that could change everything, the three felt a mixture of fear and hope. It was a leap into the void, but they were determined to face it together. The morning of the interview dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather reflected the tension that hung in the air at the Anderson mansion. Richard, Andrew, and Chloe prepared in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts and fears. Gabriel Soto arrived punctually, his face a mask of professionalism that barely concealed his curiosity and anxiety. He was received in the mansion's spacious living room where the Andersons awaited him. "Mr. Soto," Richard began, extending his hand, "we appreciate you accepting our invitation." Gabriel shook his hand, his eyes scrutinizing Richard's face. "I must admit your call took me by surprise, Mr. Anderson. It's not common for the subject of an investigation to invite the journalist to their home." "We're not a common family," Andrew intervened, with a tense smile. "And what we're about to share with you is anything but common." They took their seats, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the recording equipment Gabriel was setting up. "Before we begin," Chloe said, her voice surprisingly firm, "we want you to know that we're here to tell the whole truth. No omissions, no excuses." Gabriel looked at them, a spark of respect appearing in his eyes. "Very well," he finally said. "Let's start from the beginning." Over the next few hours, the Andersons bared their souls in front of the cameras. Richard spoke of his betrayal of Elena, of how he had stolen her idea and built an empire on that lie. His voice broke several times, especially when he described how his greed had condemned his sister and niece to years of poverty and struggle. Andrew took over, describing how he had discovered the truth, the shock and sense of betrayal he had experienced. He spoke of his journey of self-discovery and how he had decided to use the family fortune to do good. Finally, Chloe shared her story. She spoke of growing up with nothing, of her mother's death, and of how the desire for revenge had consumed her for years. With tears in her eyes, she described how she had planned to infiltrate the Anderson family, only to discover a truth more complex than she had imagined. Gabriel listened in silence, his face a mixture of astonishment and compassion. When the three finished speaking, the journalist remained silent for a long moment. "Mr. and Ms. Anderson, Ms. Rodriguez," he finally said, "I must admit that when I began this investigation, I expected to uncover a story of corruption and deception, and to some extent I have found it. But what I didn't expect was to also find a story of redemption, of people genuinely trying to make amends for their mistakes." Richard nodded slowly. "We're not seeking to justify our past actions, Mr. Soto. We just want the opportunity to demonstrate that change is possible, that even from the gravest mistakes, something good can be born." Gabriel turned off his recorder and looked at them seriously. "Do you understand that once this story comes to light, nothing will ever be the same? Your reputation, your company, everything could be affected." Andrew took Chloe's hand and looked at his father before responding. "We understand, but we believe it's a price we must pay for the truth and for the opportunity to really make a difference." When Gabriel left, the three remained in silence, the weight of what they had just done falling upon them. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Chloe finally asked. Richard looked at her, a small smile forming on his lips. "I don't know, Chloe. But for the first time in many years, I feel at peace with myself." Andrew nodded, hugging his father and Chloe. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we'll face it together as a family." As the sun began to peek through the clouds, illuminating the Anderson mansion, the three remained united, preparing to face the consequences of their honesty and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The days following the interview were a whirlwind of emotions and events. When Gabriel Soto's article was finally published, it caused the impact everyone had anticipated, and more, the Anderson story became the talk of the nation. Headlines screamed about the empire built on a lie and the Andersons' redemption. Social media exploded with divided opinions. Some applauded the family's honesty, while others called for justice and punishment. At the Anderson mansion, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Business partners demanded explanations, lifelong friends expressed their shock and disappointment, and media outlets clamored for follow-up interviews. Richard, Andrew, and Chloe gathered in the study, trying to process everything that was happening. "The company's stock has fallen 30% since this morning," Andrew reported, his face tense but determined. "Several of our major investors have threatened to withdraw their support." Chloe, who had been monitoring social media, added, "But there are also a lot of people supporting us, especially the beneficiaries of the Elena Foundation. They're sharing stories about how we've changed their lives." Richard, who had been silent, finally spoke. "We knew this could happen, but I don't regret telling the truth." At that moment, Martin, Richard's faithful assistant, rushed in. "Mr. Anderson, there are police officers at the door. They have a warrant to question you." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard slowly stood up, his face a mask of calm. "It was to be expected," he said softly. "Andrew, Chloe, don't worry, I'll face this as I should have years ago." As Richard prepared to leave with the officers, Andrew stopped him. "You're not going alone, Dad. We're in this together, remember?" Chloe nodded, standing beside Andrew. "We're a family, for better or for worse." The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster of challenges. Richard underwent long interrogations. Value faced everything head-on. Richard, who seemed to have aged years in the last few weeks, nodded slowly. "It was the right thing to do, the only thing we could do if we wanted to look our beneficiaries in the eye." Gabriel pulled out a recorder. "I'm working on a follow-up article. I want to tell the story of what's happened since the revelation, how you're handling the consequences, how this is affecting the Elena Foundation, and the people you help." Chloe, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Why? Don't you think we've had enough exposure?" Gabriel looked at her directly. "Because I believe your story isn't over, and because I believe the public deserves to see what true redemption looks like in action." The three Andersons looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Andrew spoke. "All right, Mr. Soto, but on one condition. We want you've faced everything head on." Richard, who seemed to have aged years in the last few weeks, nodded slowly. "It was the right thing to do, the only thing we could do if we wanted to look our beneficiaries in the eye." Gabriel pulled out a recorder. "I'm working on a follow-up article. I want to tell the story of what's happened since the revelation, how you're handling the consequences, how this is affecting the Elena Foundation, and the people you help." Chloe, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Why? Don't you think we've had enough exposure?" Gabriel looked at her directly. "Because I believe your story isn't over, and because I believe the public deserves to see what true redemption looks like in action." The three Andersons looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Andrew spoke. "All right, Mr. Soto, but on one condition. We want you to interview our beneficiaries too, the people whose lives have been impacted by the Elena Foundation. If we're going to tell this story, let's tell it completely." Gabriel nodded, a smile of respect forming on his lips. "Seems fair to me." As they prepared for another round of interviews, the Andersons realized that despite all the challenges, they felt more united than ever. The truth, as painful as it was, had liberated them in a way none of them had anticipated. In the days that followed, Gabriel Soto immersed himself in the world of the Elena Foundation. He interviewed dozens of beneficiaries, from young entrepreneurs who had received support to start their businesses, to women who had escaped domestic violence situations thanks to the Foundation's programs. One afternoon, as Gabriel interviewed a young mother who had managed to start her own small business thanks to the Foundation's support, Chloe watched from afar, her eyes filled with tears. "Are you okay?" Andrew asked, approaching her. Chloe nodded, wiping her eyes. "It's just that for the first time, I'm really seeing the impact of what we've been doing. And to think I was about to destroy all of this out of revenge." Andrew hugged her gently. "We all made mistakes, Chloe. The important thing is that now we're trying to do things right." Meanwhile, Richard was facing his own challenges. After long deliberations with lawyers and authorities, an agreement was reached. Richard would have to pay a substantial fine and face a community service sentence, but he would avoid jail due to his cooperation and the Foundation's efforts. The night before the agreement was to be publicly announced, Richard gathered Andrew and Chloe in the study. "I want you to know," he began, his voice laden with emotion, "that I'm incredibly proud of how you've handled all of this, Andrew. You've proven to be a much better leader than I ever was, and Chloe, your strength and compassion amaze me every day." Chloe felt a lump form in her throat. "Uncle Richard, But Richard raised a hand, gently interrupting her. "Let me finish, please. I've made a decision. I'm going to resign as CEO of the company and president of the Foundation." Andrew and Chloe looked at him in surprise. "Dad, you don't have to do this," Andrew said. Richard smiled sadly. "Yes, son, I do. It's time for me to step aside and let the new generation take the reins, Andrew. I want you to take charge of the company. And Chloe, I'd like you to lead the Elena Foundation." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Chloe spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you sure? After everything I did?" Richard approached her, taking her hands in his. "Precisely because of that, Chloe. You've experienced firsthand what it's like to struggle, what it's like to feel resentment, but you've also demonstrated an incredible capacity to forgive and to want to do good. I can't think of anyone better to lead the Foundation." Andrew nodded, putting a hand on Chloe's shoulder. "I agree. You've shown incredible strength and compassion, Chloe. The Foundation will be in excellent hands with you at the helm." Chloe looked at the two men, overwhelmed by the trust they were placing in her. I don't know what to say. Thank you. I promise I'll give my best." That night, as the three shared a quiet dinner, they felt they were finally closing a painful chapter of their lives and opening a new one full of possibilities and hope. The following months were a whirlwind of changes and challenges for the Anderson family. The transition in the leadership of the company and the Foundation was not without difficulties, but Andrew and Chloe faced each obstacle with determination and teamwork. Richard, true to his word, withdrew from public life and dedicated himself to fulfilling his community service sentence. To the surprise of many, including himself, he found deep satisfaction in direct work with needy communities. On a sunny morning, almost a year after the revelation that had changed their lives, the three met in the garden of the Anderson mansion for a family breakfast. "I have news," Chloe announced, a smile lighting up her face. "The Elena Foundation has just been nominated for the National Philanthropy Award." Andrew hugged her enthusiastically, while Richard smiled with pride. "That's wonderful, Chloe. You deserve it. You've done an incredible job." "I couldn't have done it without the support of you two," Chloe replied, her voice laden with emotion. "And without the legacy you built, Uncle Richard." Richard shook his head. "The legacy is being built by you. Now I just gave you the tools." Andrew, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "I have news too," he said, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. "I've been seeing someone, and it's serious." Chloe and Richard looked at him in surprise. "Really? Who is she?" Chloe asked, genuinely happy for her cousin. "Her name is Lucy," Andrew replied. "She's one of the foundation's beneficiaries. She has a small fair trade business that we supported last year." Richard smiled, recognizing the change in his son. "I'm happy for you, Andrew. You seem happy." "I am, Dad," Andrew responded. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." As they continued with their breakfast, sharing stories and laughter, Gabriel Soto appeared at the garden entrance, camera in hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the journalist said. A friendly smile on his face, Richard stood up to greet him. "Not at all, Gabriel. What brings you here?" Gabriel raised his camera. "I'm working on a documentary about second chances and redemption, and I can't think of a better story than yours." The three Andersons looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Chloe spoke. "You know, Gabriel, a year ago the idea of exposing our life even more would have terrified me, but now I think our story could help others to understand that it's never too late to do the right thing." Andrew nodded, taking his cousin's hand. "I agree, if our experience can inspire others to be honest, to face their mistakes and try to make amends, then it's worth sharing." Richard looked at his children with pride. "You two never cease to amaze me, Gabriel. It will be an honor to be part of your documentary." As Gabriel began to set up his equipment, the three Andersons remained united, their hands intertwined. They had weathered storms that would have destroyed less resilient families, but here they were, stronger and more united than ever. "You know," Richard said softly, looking at Andrew and Chloe, "I made many mistakes in my life, but you two, you are the best thing I've ever done. I'm so proud of who you've become." Chloe felt her eyes fill with tears. "We love you, Uncle Richard. Despite everything, we'll always love you." Andrew nodded, hugging his father and cousin. "We're a family with all our imperfections and complications, but a family nonetheless." As the sun shone down on them, illuminating their smiling faces, the Andersons prepared to share their story once more. But this time, it wasn't a story of deception and revenge, but one of forgiveness, redemption, and the transformative power of family love. Gabriel, observing the scene through his lens, smiled to himself. He had come looking for a story of scandal and downfall, but what he had found was something much more powerful, a story of rebirth and hope. As the camera began to roll, capturing the serene and determined faces of the Andersons, it was clear that their journey was just beginning, and this time they were doing it together with honesty, compassion, and a shared purpose. In that moment, under the warm morning sun, surrounded by the flowers of the garden that Elena had loved so much, the Andersons realized they had paid the price of forgiveness, and that price, though high, had been worth every penny. As the documentary filming progressed over the next few weeks, the Andersons found themselves revisiting both painful memories and moments of triumph. Each interview, each recounting of their story, seemed to further cement their bond and their commitment to their new path. One evening, after a particularly emotional day of filming, Richard, Andrew, and Chloe sat in the living room, cups of tea in hand, reflecting on how far they had come. "You know," Richard began, his voice soft with contemplation. "There was a time when I thought my legacy would be the company, the fortune I built. But now I realize the true legacy is sitting right here in this room." Andrew and Chloe looked at him, touched by his words. "Dad," Andrew said, "I used to think I knew what success looked like. I thought it was about profit margins and market share, but what we're doing now, the lives we're changing through the foundation. That's real success." Chloe nodded, her eyes glistening. "When I first came here, all I could think about was revenge. I never imagined I'd find a family, a purpose. It's like Mom's spirit has been guiding us all along." Richard reached out, taking both their hands in his. "Elena would be so proud of both of you, of all of us. We've made mistakes, big ones, but we're trying to make them right. That's what matters." As they sat there, the warmth of family surrounding them, they heard a commotion outside, curious. They went to the window and were astonished to see a crowd gathering. At the gates of the mansion, people were holding candles and signs, many bearing the logo of the Elena Foundation. Confused and a bit apprehensive, they stepped outside as they appeared. A hush fell over the crowd. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. Some were crying, others smiling broadly. Woman stepped forward, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We're here to thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. "Your honesty, your commitment to change, it's inspired so many of us. The Elena Foundation gave me a chance when no one else would. You've changed lives, including mine." One by one, people began to share their stories. A young man who had started a successful tech company with seed money from the foundation, a mother who had escaped an abusive relationship thanks to the foundation's support programs, a group of students who had received scholarships. As they listened, the Andersons felt overwhelmed by the impact their actions had had. This was the true measure of their redemption, not in dollars or accolades, but in lives touched and futures brightened. Gabriel Soto, who had been filming the entire scene, approached them, his face alight with the realization that he was capturing something truly extraordinary. "This," he said, gesturing to the crowd, "this is the real story, not just your past mistakes or your personal journey, but the ripple effect of your choices. You've started a movement of honesty and social responsibility that's touching lives far beyond what you could have imagined." As the night wore on, the impromptu gathering turned into a celebration of hope and second chances. The Andersons mingled with the crowd, listening to stories, sharing hugs, and reaffirming their commitment to their new path. Later that night, as they said goodbye to the last of the well-wishers, the three stood together, looking out over the now quiet grounds. "You know," Chloe said softly, "I think this is what Mom always wanted. Not the money or the success, but this making a real difference in people's lives." Andrew nodded, putting an arm around her shoulders. "We're honoring her memory in the best way possible." Richard, looking at his son and niece, felt a peace he hadn't known in years. "We've been given a rare gift," he said. "The chance to rewrite our story, to leave a legacy of kindness and integrity. Let's make the most of it." As they turned to go back inside, they knew that while their journey of redemption wasn't over, they were on the right path. Together, they were turning a tale of greed and betrayal into one of hope, second chances, and the enduring power of family love. The Anderson saga, once a cautionary tale of ambition gone wrong, was becoming an inspiring story of transformation and the ripple effect of doing good. And as they closed the door on this extraordinary night, they looked forward to writing the next chapters of their story, together as a family, united by love, forgiveness, and a shared commitment to making the world a little bit better, one life at a time.